Welcome to week 7, Imagery. So as I mentioned last week, the lecture today is going to be a lot more practical in nature in terms of a specific intervention that is used a lot in sports psychology. So hopefully you get a bit of an opportunity to take on board this information and really think about how you could actually apply this strategy of imagery with athletes or students. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into today, and hopefully you'll finish this lecture with something really practical to be able to use. So as always, I just want to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm recording this lecture from the Gold Coast. So what we're going to be learning and looking at today is what is imagery, and really understand what the science behind imagery is. So is there actually research that suggests it works, particularly in terms of performance enhancement? Then we're going to learn about a specific PET-LEP approach to imagery, which is really a reflection based on what we find in the research in terms of parts of imagery, strategies that really do have that utility and evidence-based. And then finally, I'm going to just highlight how the use of imagery can be incorporated with those mindfulness skills that I've introduced quite a bit throughout the lectures so far. Also highlighting early on that imagery is one of the strategies that is quite effortlessly integrated into a mindfulness skills approach. So general imagery such as the PET-LEP approach can be quite consistent with those mindfulness skills. Okay, so what is imagery? So in terms of the practical definition, there are a few components to imagery. So what we're really talking about is creating in our mind. So that ability of creation and recreation of an experience generated from memory that involves multiple components. So the sensory, perceptual, and affective. Quasi-sensory being perception-like feelings or non-specific awareness of a presence. Quasi-perceptual is conscious mental experiences that resemble perception but are not directly triggered by external sensory input. And quasi-affective is intense emotional experiences like fear or sadness that feel genuine but are not based on beliefs that the situation is real. Often experienced while engaging with fiction, art, or make-believe. So I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of the term visualization, and you might be wondering how visualization might differ to imagery. Well, this is the part of the definition that really differentiates the two. So when you think about visualization, we're thinking about using the sense of visual memory to recreate an image or a memory. Whereas imagery is using visualization as well as other components such as affective, perceptual, and other senses. So the way that you can think about the difference is that imagery is using a combination of different aspects, whereas visualization can be more thought of as more of that singular component. And so that's why we're introducing the idea of imagery as our skill rather than just visualization. Because as I'll talk about a little bit more throughout the lecture, making the imagery in your mind as realistic as possible to the experience is really what the research suggests helps with its effectiveness. So just using visualization is missing out on a lot of components that make the image more realistic in your mind and more similar to the actual experience. And so using multiple senses really enhances that component. So it's totally fine if you think about visualization or you use the word visualization, but just remember that visualization is just more focused on one component, and imagery is a word we really want to be using for this skill because we're using multiple senses. Particularly in the PET-LEP approach, it really goes through how we can use each of the different components. So hopefully that clears that up for you, and if any of you are wondering what that difference was. Now just highlighting that imagery is in the control of the imager. So the person themselves is recreating an image in their own mind and they have full control. And the last part, it may occur in the absence of real stimulus. So when they say may, What it means is that sometimes actual components of the experience can be incorporated into your imagery, such as holding a tennis racket while using imagery. But in general, the idea is that you're not actually performing this skill. When if you're actually performing the physical skill, then that is where it no longer becomes imagery. And then it becomes a physical practice. So those are kind of the key components whenever we're referring to imagery throughout the lecture. Just think of some of those key components. So it's a recreation of an experience in the mind. It's using multiple different sensory, perceptual, and affective characteristics. And it's done in the absence of that physical, actual experience. So we'll just go on now to really understand how imagery really relates to the research. But firstly, I just want to highlight here a couple of real-world athletes that have kind of mentioned the use of imagery in their practice and experience. So this is Wayne Rooney, and I'm not a soccer or football person, so if any of you are, this guy might be a legend in your eyes. And so he actually talked about lying in bed before the game and visualizing himself scoring goals or doing well. He mentioned you're trying to put yourself in that moment and trying to prepare yourself to have a memory before the game. And so he said, I don't know if you call it visualizing or dreaming, but I've always done it my whole life. So what I think Wayne Rooney is really referring to here is that he may not have learned an official kind of PET-LEP approach to imagery, but what he's kind of referring to is that just naturally, he's always kind of started to see himself in his mind performing really well. And so a lot of those components of imagery, some athletes will already be doing this before you actually teach this skill. There are some people that naturally learn to do this themselves, and I think this is a relevant way to Wayne Rooney. The other person here is Michael Jordan. Hopefully most of you know who that is. Now, there's been a lot of quotes from him in particular, really talking about the aspect of imagery or visualization. So in this particular quote, he spoke about, I visualized where I wanted to be, what kind of player I wanted to become. I knew exactly where I wanted to go, and I focused on getting there. Michael Jordan is someone who is really clearly highlighted and specifically focused on the training component as being crucial to his success. And he's even mentioned not only physical training, but mental training. With some of these quotes on the internet, I know it's sometimes hard to necessarily verify how accurate they are, but I've also come across a multiple quotes around him talking about before the whistle is blown or before the ball is thrown up. He's mentioned something along the lines of he's already played that person out in his head and practiced what he would do. And he mentioned that he then feels like he's got an advantage over other people because he's already done it in his head multiple times. So yeah, he's someone that I think really promotes this idea of visualization. Visualizing what you want to do, what kind of player you want to be, and that idea of seeing yourself doing it successfully. He's a real advocate for that. So hopefully that just gives you a couple of examples that this is not just a skill that we talk about in lectures and not use in the real world. No, this is actually a really useful skill, and a lot of really high-level athletes use it quite often. So yeah, particularly Wayne Rooney and Michael Jordan, I think they're pretty good examples of successful athletes. So the science behind imagery is quite expansive. There has been quite a bit of research on this topic because imagery is one of those sports psychology skills that has been around for a very long time. And so thankfully, there was a meta-analysis done in 2021 that looked across multiple different studies to really draw out what is the effectiveness of imagery. Now, just reminding you here, particularly for those looking at their seminar topics and looking at what is a good quality of research, meta-analysis, as we talked about in one of the earlier lectures, it's one of those examples of high-level research. We want the meta-analysis, the randomized control trials, the systematic reviews, or the journals or journal articles. Those are what we're really looking at for that high level of research. So just putting that out there as you're going through your literature when putting together your seminars. So here we've got a few key findings from this meta-analysis, And I'm also going to put this one in your recommended readings so you can have a look at this a little bit more in depth as well. The first one, and most importantly, is that imagery was found to have a significant positive effect on performance. So that underlying focus of, does this skill or intervention actually work? Well, based on a lot of different studies, based on this meta-analysis, it was found to have a statistically significant medium effect. So that's a really good impact on performance. And just highlighting as well in the research article, it did talk about the fact that the research was being done to also incorporate randomized control trials. So that idea of having an intervention group of imagery and a control group. So I think they had different control groups, but when we're thinking about the control groups, it's that idea of no intervention. And it was found that imagery was a causal relationship. So it's not just correlational, it's also causal. So the intervention of performing imagery has been found to have a statistically significant impact on performance. So that's a great finding, and this is where we identify it as a skill that we really want to be teaching athletes and students because it's effective. Now, the effectiveness of imagery was seen across different settings in sports. So it was highlighted that it's not just for one particular sport, it's seen across a broad range of sports that it is very effective. Now, also highlighting there, and I'll mention this in a little bit over another point, but the way you might use imagery might differ a little bit depending on the sport and depending on the type of athlete, but I'll go into that a little bit later. But what you just need to know here is that it is effective across different sports. And one of the most interesting parts about this research is that imagery was found to significantly enhance the effectiveness of physical practice. Now, the important part here is that within the research, they actually accounted for the aspects of the amount of practice. And so what I'm saying here is that based on the research, having physical practice alongside imagery was found to be more effective than just increasing the physical practice to be the same amount of time that imagery was incorporated. So what they're indicating here is that the use of imagery actually adds some kind of additional component that physical practice alone can't bring. And so the understanding or the explanation for this was that from a theoretical perspective, the theory behind imagery is that what it's actually doing is it's actually activating neural pathways in the brain. And the idea of imagery is that it shares a lot of similar neural pathways as the physical practice. However, it is suspected that the neural networks do not totally overlap. And so the idea is that even though there's quite a few that overlap, there's some kind of neural pathway that imagery is touching on that physical practice doesn't. And this pathway that it's activating seems to be a facilitator of improved performance. So the idea is that combining mental and physical practice is superior to just physical practice alone. So you're thinking about this theory of imagery, understanding that it is proposed that it activates neural pathways that overlap with physical practice, but is not totally similar. That there is some neural pathways that are slightly divergent, and those neural pathways that it's activating seem to be quite useful. So really think about that. That's probably quite an important part of understanding the theories behind why we think imagery works. And it's the activation of those neural pathways that are similar to physical practice, but are slightly different. And we'll go through a little bit more further around some of the components that suggest why imagery helps with this. So the other component, and this hopefully will be pretty expected, is that the effectiveness of imagery is dosage specific. So more sessions of imagery are linked to increase effectiveness. Now, when you're teaching this skill to athletes, even though that idea might seem logical to us, it is possible that athletes or students could fall into the trap of thinking, okay, well, I've used imagery one time and it didn't really work for me, so therefore the skill doesn't work, right? That can be a little bit of a trap that athletes can fall into. So I'm just really using the idea of those mental skills need to be practiced in a similar way to physical skills, like training at the gym. You have to be consistent and practice it over time for it to have an impact. So using that way of explaining it is really important. The other component is that the effects of imagery have been shown in retention studies, which basically means that over time, over a longer period of time, the benefits of imagery are still there. So it's not as if you just kind of do it before one particular performance and you might get the gains in that performance and then it just disappears. No, it's actually really similar to training physically at the gym, where if you train consistently over a period of time at the gym, you build those physical muscles. Well, this is suggesting that you're building those neural pathways. So instead of physical muscles, we're thinking about creating neural pathways that are actually maintained over time. Now, just highlighting here that within the meta-analysis, within the research, and within most of the studies on imagery, the effectiveness has been linked to motor performance. And so what we mean by that is most of the studies have examined the implementation of an imagery intervention and then have looked at physical skills, physical performance, and motor skills. I'm going to highlight in a minute other components that have been looked at in terms of imagery, in terms of psychological factors and other things alike. But yeah, just thinking about here that a lot of the bulk of the research, the really good quality research, is looking at motor performance outcomes over and above any other performance benefit that you could get. Okay, so now we're going to go into some specifics around the PET-LEP approach. So if we're thinking about understanding what PET-LEP is, we're thinking about functional equivalence. Now, I mentioned earlier in this lecture already that the idea behind imagery working is that it highlights similar neural pathways to the physical skill. So the whole idea behind PET-LEP is that if we can bring as many similar components as possible to the actual performance, the theory is that it will increase the effectiveness of the imagery intervention. And the research has shown this overall to be quite true. That the more similar we get the imagery to the actual performance, the more it resembles the actual performance, the more likely that the neural pathway for that performance is going to be activated, and the more likely it's going to support performance enhancement. So that functional equivalence is really important component for us to understand why imagery works. So I'm really going to summarize this. It's the idea that when we're doing imagery, we want to make it as similar as possible, using as many different components as possible to the actual performance. So that's what the PET-LEP acronym is really highlighting. It's highlighting the relevant components that should be acknowledged when applying imagery. So hopefully that makes sense. So in terms of the specific components of PET-LEP, we're looking here at the physical component. So when we're thinking about the physical component, we're thinking about imagining in your mind the physical characteristics of the performance. So I've mentioned here aspects such as looking at, okay, what posture do you have when you're doing the sport? Are you holding a tennis racket if you're a tennis player? What uniform are you wearing? What location are you on? And can you imagine yourself on a physical tennis court to enhance the realistic nature of it? So a lot of coaches or practitioners have really tried to actually incorporate the physical surroundings to be more like performing. So doing imagery on the actual tennis court or on the actual soccer field so that you can really promote the realistic nature of that performance. Of course, we have to be realistic that that's not always possible, but as much as you can, try and incorporate elements that can be as similar as possible. Some people also like to use a tennis racket, so you could physically be holding a tennis racket while you're using the imagery. Anything that you can use or do to make the imagery more realistic, based on the research, they tend to indicate that could be quite useful. However, it's not to say that it won't be effective if you don't have a physical tennis racket or if you don't have the physical surrounds of the actual performance environment. It doesn't say it's not effective. It's just saying the more realistic you can make it, the more likely it is to be effective. So yeah, just keep that in mind, and obviously practicalities need to be taken into account as well. So I think I've kind of highlighted there both the physical and the environmental aspects. So physical components as well as the environment where the performance takes place. And then we have tasks. So the task should resemble the real world performance. And this is the important part. It needs to relate to the skill level of the athlete. So a novice athlete needs to be imagining themselves performing real skills that they are capable of doing in real life. So an example of this is if you have a novice AFL player, it's probably not going to be beneficial for them to imagine themselves doing a really complex task, like a check side kick from the boundary, if they never do that in real training and don't have the skill level to perform that task. That's not necessarily going to relate to their skill level as an athlete. Whereas if they are a novice football player, one of those things that they might be doing is practicing with imagery, maybe bending down and picking up the ball. That might be a task that they're capable of doing that maybe they're struggling with a little bit. So they might be practicing doing that skill, using imagery to get better at it, but it's within their skill range. So that's a really important component when you're explaining this to an athlete or a student, is making sure that it's within their skill level. Timing. So with this PET-LEP approach and with the research, there is a lot of different components that could be used in different circumstances. And so what I'm saying here is some general advice, and that doesn't mean that you can't adapt it to the individual and to the specific purpose of what you're doing. So with timing, it's ideally imagined at the correct speed for the real performance. Because when we think about that idea of functional equivalence, using as many components as possible, we want it to be equivalent to the real performance. So what the research has suggested is that when people are trying to use imagery, if they speed up the skill, it's actually shown that could cause the athlete to speed it up in real life and actually fumble and not perform that skill well. So as much as possible, the correct speed of what the performance is actually going to look like is most useful. But just highlighting here that there can be caveats to that, particularly an example where maybe it's a really novice athlete and you might look at slowing down the skill to help them with those real motor movements, how they actually perform the skill. So there can be a place for that. So this advice I'm giving you is more general and in relation to performance enhancement. And so if we're making an assumption that the athlete has a grasp on the skills already, then real correct speed for the real performance would be most helpful. Overall, best practice is always to focus on the individual, and if focusing on the individual is slightly different to the general advice from the research, that's okay, because you would have a rationale for why you're doing it slightly differently. So just giving you that freedom and that flexibility to adapt to the client, as that's always going to be most important. So with the learning component, the content should be adapted to the stage of learning. So the idea of this is similar to what I was referring to in that last comment around, is the athlete using imagery for more of a skill acquisition phase where they don't necessarily have the motor skills yet? Or are they more of that higher level athlete where their skill is already autonomous and they're actually trying to practice in game situations? So when it says going from cognitive to more autonomous, we're thinking about, is the imagery breaking that skill down into the motor components of the skill? Like how I actually flick my wrist for a basketball free throw, for example. So that would be more cognitive rather than autonomous. So we're not trying to break down the motor skill, we're assuming that that's going to be quite automatic, but rather we're looking at moving to more autonomous skills, such as strategy in a rugby match. Like imagining yourself taking a sidestep, or what play are you going to do? You might practice imagery using a particular play, and that play is not necessarily thinking about how you would run or how you would throw the ball. Those things are automatic. But you're thinking about how would you execute a game plan during a match? That would be considered more autonomous. Then we have emotion. So incorporate the presence of the same emotions that come out in the actual performance. But it's always kind of highlighted that the emotions generally should be facilitated for performance. So it probably wouldn't be overly helpful if during an imagery an athlete was fixated on performing and they visualize themselves having a panic attack, right? That's not going to bring about a supportive or facilitative element to performance. But you could certainly look at something like anxiety where it could be facilitative or it could be detrimental. For example, the athlete could potentially be using imagery to practice allowing the anxiety to be there and responding to that anxiety in a helpful way, and seeing that anxiety as facilitative because the athlete might see that anxiety as rocket fuel. And so they're imagining themselves being a bit anxious, but they imagine themselves performing well, even though the anxiety is there. So that even is hinting at a little bit of mindfulness or a bit of a mindful way of using imagery because you're incorporating making room for that experience. So yeah, just in general, whenever we're doing imagery, this is a really key and crucial point. You always imagine yourself performing the skill successfully. And so if your athlete or student is ever engaging in imagery and you notice them talking themselves through making mistakes, you would just stop the imagery and pause and give a bit of feedback that we're always imagining ourselves performing that successfully. Because what we're doing based on the research and based on the theory behind imagery is that you're going to be strengthening the neural pathways behind the skills. And so you don't want to be strengthening a neural pathway around making a mistake. That wouldn't be helpful. So that's a really important part of this. Then lastly, perspective. So different studies have found it useful to actually have a combination of different perspectives. So again, it's going to come down to the individual as well, but thinking about generally first-person perspective or third-person perspective is going to come more naturally to certain athletes. And so certainly let them lead with whatever they're strongest at. But based on the research, it also mentioned that it can be helpful to kind of mix it up a little bit and use both at different times. So there's a bit of research around that actually being useful and potentially being useful because it's strengthening different neural pathways in the brain around that first versus that third person perspective. So yeah, that's something else you might want to think about, how you could mix that up for the athlete, whether they're encouraged to do it in a first or third person perspective. So I'm just going to go through a bit of a practical example of this approach, and then I will introduce a short video of an athlete from the winter sports domain and how they've used imagery and similar components of the PET-LEP approach so that you can hopefully have some real concrete examples of what we're actually talking about. So the example I'm about to take you through is for a basketball player who's at high school level who's struggling with that consistency in free throws under pressure. Now, before I take you through an example, I just want to mention that if you were going to be talking an athlete or a student through this, you might want to set this up a little bit. So sometimes it can be quite helpful to get the athlete or student to sit upright in a chair, take a couple of deep breaths, and then just encourage them to gently shut their eyes or stare at a space on the wall if they feel more comfortable. And then you would just talk it through like this. As you begin, I want you to actually feel your body as if you're at the free throw line. Your feet are shoulder width apart, weight evenly balanced. Knees are slightly bent, ready to generate power. You can feel the basketball in your hands, the texture, the grip, the familiarity. Your shooting hand sits comfortably under the ball. Your guide hand steady on the side. Now bring in your surroundings. You're on your home court. You can see the hoop clearly in front of you. The backboard square, the orange rim, the net hanging still. Notice the lighting, the sounds in the space, the familiarity of this environment. This is where you've done this many times before. Now focus on the action itself. You're taking your free throw, smooth, controlled, automatic. You don't need to overthink the mechanics. Your body knows this. You see the ball leave your hands with a clean upward arc, spinning naturally, heading straight towards the center of the hoop. Let this happen in real time, no slowing it down, just like it would unfold in a game. You move through your routine, you take the shot, and watch the ball travel naturally through the air. This is your skill, one you've practiced over and over. Trust that it's automatic now. You don't need to break it down. You're reinforcing what already works. The arc, the rhythm, the feel of the release. Now notice what you feel. Maybe there's some nervous energy there. That's totally okay. Instead of pushing it away, use it. Let it sharpen your focus. It draws your attention to the rim, to your target, to the moment. And you're seeing this all through your own eyes. You're in your body, fully present, fully connected to this shot. Your attention is locked onto the rim, the arc, and the follow through. As you take the shot, you see the ball swish through that basketball ring, and you're successful every time. So hopefully you picked up on those components from each of the phases of the PET-LEP model. And I use this example because there's specific research focused on imagery for free throws, shoots that has found that it significantly improved performance. And particularly for basketball, where you may not be able to have access to a basketball court all the time. So this can be a really useful one to really practice that skill in your mind and incorporate it with that physical practice. Also highlighting you would want to do that differently for a different athlete, but it's recommended to use the PET-LEP approach. So one way you can do this is to target it to the individual, is to get them to write out their own script, and then you could give them feedback on that script and ensure that it aligns with the PET-LEP approach. And then the athlete can start imagining that script in their mind. This can also come in handy in sports where there's only so much they can do physically in training before it becomes detrimental to their body and they risk overdoing it. So imagery is such a powerful and useful skill to assist with performance enhancement. So this is now just a brief example of an Olympic athlete talking about components of imagery. So I'm just going to play the video now.
I usually kind of do this like off to the side, away from everybody, sort of in my own quiet space. When you're in the gate and you're standing there getting ready to drop, it is the most present, hyper-focused moment of my entire life. I've just sort of buckled my snowboard on. I can feel the pressure of my straps on my ankles. Is it snowing or is it sunny? Is there wind on my face? I reach over to the gate. I make sure the handles are adjusted to the right height. I'm looking at the top of the start gate, just waiting for it to move, trying to feel what that adrenaline's like. The gate opens, I can hear it. It makes like an audible click. I imagine like the exhale of my breath, because you're holding your breath. When you pull, you're pulling as hard as you can and trying to generate as much speed. And so it's like this exhale and react. I have to move really quickly over the first two features. It's real target shooting. You really have to like barely pick your feet up and over. I can hear the wind going through my goggles, and I can sort of feel it on my eyes. Going probably 40 miles an hour through there. I'm jockeying for position, making sure that my body position's really good. I know people are going to be trying to crowd my space. If you're driving a car and you have a 5-lane road and 6 cars and you're all trying to fight to go the fastest, you're going to hit each other. You're going to bump against each other. You're going to trade pain. Rubbing is racing, being close to each other. That's the chaos. Like if you slip up in the first corner, your day could be done. It's like first round, first run. I always imagine taking a pretty big, deep breath. You're about halfway through the course. A lot of times you can hear like an edge running through the snow or somebody coming up short on a jump. My heart rate's going through my roof. If there's a competitor in front of me, I'm staying right on their tail and breaking off to the left just at the last second before I go through the last 2 rollers and across the finish line. even when I'm just visualizing it right now, when I cross the finish line, it's this like huge relief. It's like, okay, I made it down safe. I'm going on to the next round. Like, let's do this again. I'm not out there knitting sweaters, you know, like I'm racing border cross because it makes me feel alive and because I love it. It's gnarly. God damn, it's probably, yeah, it's the best drug you can be able to do, so it's good.
So now I'm just going to go over some additional considerations. So the use of imagery has, as I mentioned, predominantly focused on motor skill and motor performance. But there are additional components where some of the research suggests imagery can be useful for. However, what I'm just highlighting here is that the strength of the research in these domains is not as strong. So the use of imagery for injury rehabilitation, it has been reduced to a reduction in the perception of pain. And so there is some relatively good research around this. And so what we know is that pain is always processed in the mind, whether or not there's an actual physical cause of it. So any kind of mental or physical or psychological factors that can certainly influence perceptions of pain. And so using imagery in injury rehabilitation, it's often been used around different components, but kind of seeing the athlete successfully engage in rehabilitation exercises. Some imagery kind of goes to the extent of seeing the tendons strengthening and the components of self-efficacy as well. So that confidence in the athlete's ability to successfully rehabilitate and engage with improved motor function. Although all of these components have had a positive correlation with imagery, there is a recent meta-analysis where it was found that self-efficacy, perceived pain, and function was not statistically significant. But that meta-analysis highlighted that it's not because imagery doesn't necessarily work, it's just there hasn't been enough studies with high enough power to get that statistical significance. So that's probably going into a bit more detail around the research methods, but just highlighting here that it does look like imagery can be supportive for injury rehabilitation. It's just more research needs to be done for us to have a conclusive evidence on it. The thing that actually does have quite a good bit of evidence though is overall improvements in strength. So studies for weightlifters and powerlifters have actually found an improvement in the execution of movements for actually those strength tasks. And injured athletes have actually shown a 50% maintenance of strength. So what the research is actually showing is that by actually imagining doing the strength-based activity, it's the understanding that the brain is sending the messages to those muscles, and even though the muscles aren't actually moving, it's actually reducing the rate of deterioration of strength for people who are immobilized, who aren't using the limb because of injury, for example. And with weightlifters and powerlifters, it's thought that by using imagery, it supports that kind of confidence in that ability to execute the skill successfully. And it's also that it then helps to enable that facilitated process of the athlete being able to see performance gains. So it's still, I guess, in the strength component, as it's supporting those weightlifters and those athletes to perform that skill successfully because they have practiced it over and over in their mind. They know how to perform that skill even better because of imagery. So it's really interesting research around injuries and strength. But yeah, as I mentioned, there's a little bit more that needs to be done to really confirm some of those findings. But nonetheless, there's some positive correlations there around different components rather than just performance enhancement. So I'm just going to finish off the lecture with highlighting how mindfulness skills can be incorporated into our imagery component. As I mentioned at the start of the lecture, by using the PET-LEP approach, or imagery in general, it's not necessarily going against mindfulness skills. It can be quite consistent, even just using it within itself. However, I will just note that sometimes you could either use imagery for more of a direct intervention like we've spoken about with cognitive behavior therapy, such as in a relaxation strategy. or what we're talking about right now is it can also be used in more of a mindful way. So when we think about imagery approaches that facilitate more of a mindfulness way, it's about opening up to the emotions, doing what matters, and bringing attention back to the present moment. And this was even demonstrated in that basketball example we went through. So there's some examples mentioned here of how you can incorporate imagery in a more mindful way. So imagining oneself engaging in a committed action. So for example, despite not feeling confident, an AFL player might imagine themselves going after the ball despite the presence of fear. So what we're talking about here is those facilitative emotions. Yep, there's an emotion here, but there's also the belief that you can overcome it. And so really that committed action component of being in the present, committing to what matters, that could be a really useful way of incorporating mindfulness. The other one is using imagery for emotions and thoughts. And I'm not sure if many of you have heard of emotions talked about in this way, but in a mindful approach to maybe using that diffusion method on the hexaflex, we can actually create some space for that emotion by seeing it and so describing it. So what does that emotion, for example, of sadness look like? And, the athlete or student might say, well, the sadness is really black and it's like a jagged edge of a triangle and it feels really heavy. And so this is more of a way of relating to and diffusing from getting caught up in the thoughts and feelings, rather to describe them as more of a physical property. And the other one is just imagining oneself being successful in competitions. So that one is pretty much a pet-lep example in essence, as you're always going to be enabling yourself to perform that skill successfully when you're doing imagery. But you might just notice that could be useful for an athlete that's really caught up in that they're a failure. And so what we're actually doing with imagery is we're introducing the practice of seeing themselves actually performing that skill successfully, right? So those are just a few examples, but as I mentioned, you don't necessarily even need to be too conscious of making or forcing the imagery to be a more mindful way, because it's naturally quite consistent with mindfulness by using the pet-lep approach. It's more about being mindful of the words that you use. So if you're wanting to be consistent with a more mindful way of doing imagery, for example, whenever you're incorporating the affective component, so the emotional component, using terms like making space for it instead of trying to get rid of it. So really minor alterations in wording can make a big difference in being consistent with more of that mindfulness approach. Alrighty, so that is it from me today. Hopefully you got some practical learning out of today, and I really encourage you to, as you go through this lecture, think about how you could even apply this imagery skill to yourself if you are an athlete currently competing as well.